In his 2012 book, The Inconvenient Indian, a curious account of Native people in North America, Indigenous author Thomas King points out that relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples have not changed much over the centuries. Guns and bugles may be a thing of the past, but 21st century North America continues to hold on to its feelings of disdain and superiority. That may not be what you want to hear on this day when we honor the Indigenous peoples with whom we share this country. However, in light of the racism encountered in response to the rail barricades erected in support of the Wet'suwet'en traditional leaders, the hereditary chiefs, the reality King describes is more accurate than is comfortable. Social media was rife with racist comments. There seemed little willingness on the part of settler folks to consider that possibly this was more than a single issue. Many non-Indigenous settler people have wrestled with the legacy of 500 years of racist policies. Let us pray that this agreement enables changes that uphold just and fair relations. We must hold out hope because the inertia that accompanies our current state of relationship needs to shift dramatically. June 2020 is the 5th anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's, TRC's, release of its 94 calls to action. How many of our United Church people have read all 94 calls, or even just those directed particularly at churches? What is the likelihood that there are good people who don't remember that there was a TRC? And that it wasn't the altruism of the federal government that birthed the TRC, but rather a condition of the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. Prior to the release of its report from 2008 to 2014, the TRC crisscrossed Canada listening to the survivors of residential schools speak their truth of abuses, physical, emotional, and spiritual. Survivors shared the horrors that traumatized and continue to traumatize. Settler folk were shocked by the accounts of sexual and physical abuse, dietary restrictions, electric chairs, and sensory deprivation. Truth is, the survivors have been telling these stories for generations. Many of us didn't listen until they were broadcast into our living rooms. The report that concluded the work of the TRC is a document Canadians should have a look at, if not read completely. And the calls to action should be required reading. The United Church of Canada is one of the parties to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, and 14 of the 94 calls relate to that relationship. On this National Indigenous Day of Prayer, let's focus on Call 46. We call upon the parties of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement to develop and sign a covenant of reconciliation that would identify principles for working collaboratively to advance reconciliation in Canadian society. And that would include, but not be limited to, reaffirmation of the parties' commitment to reconciliation, repudiation of concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, and the reformation of laws, governance structures, and policies within their respective institutions that to continue to rely on such concepts. Full adoption and implementation of the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples as a framework for reconciliation. support for the renewal or establishment of treaty relationships based on principles of mutual recognition, mutual respect, and shared responsibility for maintaining those relationships into the future, enabling those excluded from the settlement agreement to sign on to the covenant of reconciliation, enabling additional parties to sign on to the covenant of reconciliation. It is a concern that the word reconciliation has become a bit of a buzzword in our culture. As people of faith, we need to recognize this as a biblical principle and tenet of our faith tradition. Reconciliation is key to relationships that are mutual and respectful, in which all parties in the relationship are valued. Only then, as we heard from storyteller Matthew, can we offer our best at the altar. Only then does our gift have integrity. When we recognize there's conflict, it's our responsibility to seek restoration of that relationship. The key, of course, is that wounds need to heal, and that requires time and patience on all sides of the conflict. Seeking reconciliation manifests the kingdom of the divine in our midst. Call to Action 46 relies upon the settlement agreement parties, our church as one, to be vigilant about reconciliation and understand the possible impact on relationships between communities of faith and Indigenous communities as we live into a reconciled relationship. Our church has been earnest and sincere in the years since the TRC report was presented. Even though the United Church operated residential schools, many in our congregations continue to be unaware of that truth. Education continues to be paramount in our journey to reconciliation. Indigenous people were forever changed by their experiences in our care. The generations following continue to deal with the legacy. The trauma is multi-generational. Non-Indigenous settler people must grapple with Christianity's role in the genocide many continue to deny. Do you know about the Justice and Reconciliation Fund? It was established in 2000 by the Residential School Steering Committee of the United Church and assists the church in understanding and responding to the legacy of harm and broken relationships that have resulted from the Indian residential school system. The fund supports projects by United Church groups and partners that foster education, dialogue, reconciliation, and relationship building between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Monies are available to communities of faith who meet the goals of the fund. The good news is that the number of applications has increased in the last couple of years. So there are people in our midst aware of the calls to action and willing to make the effort to seek reconciliation. This is good news for all of us, and it should be our communal prayer that soon, very soon, every community of faith will gain an understanding of the historical racism that birthed the residential school system and the Indian Act. It needs to continually be our prayer that reluctance to see the latest attempts by Indigenous people and allies to influence the dominant culture's ignorance to the lack of just relationships will be diminished. With every fiber of their being, the Christ lived and modeled relationships grounded in mutuality. The kingdom of our loving Creator dreams for each of us to live in is here and coming. Let's all work toward that reality for our siblings. And then perhaps authors like Thomas King can soon write about how the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people has become one that upholds all of us. And as I prayed with you last week, I continue to pray. May all that is holy grant each of us the courage to trust that we are all created in the image of the One who is beyond the beyond, and beyond that also. This is part of our story.